Just before we speak to Dr. Usama Hasan from the Quilliam International, let's hear from one of the parents of some of the victims in here. We've got a clip of Martin Hett's mother and stepfather Feigen and Stuart Murray outside the court today after the sentencing.
We are the ones with the life sentence, aren't we?
Yeah. It's been a roller coaster of emotions the last day and a half, hearing how it's affected so many people. I don't think any sentence could change things for us or undo what we have to go through.
A life sentence for them. Well, let's now talk to the Iman Dr Usama Hasan from Quilliam International, who joins us live via video call. Good evening to you, Dr Hasan.
Good evening, Cristo.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to us here on talkRADIO. I think most people are quite horrified when they remind themselves of the details of what happened in Manchester. Do you firstly think that the 55-year sentence, is that going to provide any reassurance for any of us, do you think?
Well, obviously it was a terrible tragedy, and as you said, we think first of the victims and their families. Half of the ones killed were children, under 18, and of course many others injured, some with appalling injuries, and as many of them have said, they're living a life sentence effectively. And I think this is a record determinate prison sentence. So from that point of view, it's some relief or consolation that the courts have finally decided to get tough on terrorists like this. And it is a very long sentence, of course, for a young man, quite deservedly. As the judge said, he was just as guilty as the actual suicide bomber, his own brother.
And we're choosing not to name them, by the way, just so that I can make you aware of that, because I always get a little frustrated that sometimes we talk about the perpetrators perhaps a little bit more than the victims, and their name becomes a little bit more well known. How do you think we can stop this happening again? Radicalisation, these people were radicalised. We've heard lots of stories of radicalisation taking place when it comes to British-born Muslims. Why is that still happening?
Well, thank you. That's the key question. And we hope actually that this kind of thing will stop happening or not happen so often. With the decline of the so-called Islamic State group, the number of attacks has reduced in Europe, although there are a lot of plots. But coming back to something you were saying earlier, the way to stop this is to fundamentally deal with the ideas which motivate such people. And we know what we call Islamist ideology, not Muslim or Islamic faith, but a political ideology known as Islamism, which sees Muslims worldwide as a separate nation to everybody else. And one of the ramifications of that is that they don't see themselves as British. They don't feel loyal to Britain or in fact to any other country unless it's some very, very pure Islamic state in their view. And based on that, they then view all non-believers or non-Muslims as enemies and potential targets.
Because this is what I find a little frustrating. And, I abhor the people that sort of band all Muslims together and say, oh my word, you must be a terrorist, and all of this absolute horrific prejudice that comes out as a result of attacks. However, I do also feel that what isn't discussed enough is the elephant in the room, and that is the Islamist countries, entire nations that have ideologies which I think add credibility to then someone sitting in their bedroom who might be more likely to be radicalised. Well, it's very difficult to tell that person in their bedroom that Islam is the religion of peace, which it is for most people, when you have entire states, entire nations that don't share that ideology seemingly towards their own citizens. Is that the elephant in the room that perhaps isn't discussed enough, do you think?
Chris, I think you're partly hitting at the right answer there. In fact, those countries are actually discussed quite a lot. The elephant in the room is actually groups in this country, in Britain, which have actively promoted those kinds of extreme ideas and continue to apologize and make excuses for terrorist acts by blaming, for example, the British government or foreign policy, or any other grievance they may have under a democracy, their right to have, and they have the right to air it. But there's no excuse for a young man to target a concert attended by children.
No, please don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way giving an excuse. But what?
Talk about you.
No. But the point I'm making is, though, that if you are repeatedly told that, and I see it as well among people who find it confusing when they are repeatedly told through the media, quite rightly, so that people who are Muslim can live their lives without any kind of prejudice and live their lives in peace. But we have a continual narrative in the media that Islam is a peaceful religion. But then what you then see is entire Islamic countries that don't seem to portray that version. Now, I understand there are different versions of Islam. There is the Islamism that you have just described. And to me, I think that makes not only people susceptible to being radicalised, but I think just normal people in their day-to-day lives look at that and see a contradiction.
Yeah, and obviously Muslims are aware of this. There are nearly 50 Muslim majority countries in the world. So it's very important to avoid generalizations, actually. And of the Islamist countries, probably the two that come to mind, or for their influence for the last 40 years especially, are Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, Saudi Arabia has begun to liberalize. That's very well known. It's slowly, having more rights for women, etc. It's got a long way to go, but it's changing slowly. Iran, sadly, hasn't. But if I come back to my point, actually, at Quilliam, we showed and we exposed with the full transcript and the audio recording of an extremist sermon given in a mosque in Manchester, which was regularly attended by the bomber, which called for, very irresponsibly and recklessly, called for armed jihad to help people suffering in Syria. Now, this was at a time of a humanitarian crisis in Syria, and emotions were high. But as we showed, this imam who held a captive audience and preached, for half an hour, was actually totally unqualified to address a major mosque of maybe 1,000 people or more, and call for armed jihad. This was literally a few weeks, 3 or 4 months before the actual bombing. And we know that these kinds of sermons have been given, for the last 20, 30 years in this country. Thankfully, they've reduced in number a lot. But this was still going on just a few years ago.
I think I remember a question time. Actually.
This was mosque attended by the bomber, and we know he was in contact. This imam was in contact with the bomber himself as well. So we need Muslim communities to actually take ownership, as you're suggesting. The vast majority of Muslims are appalled by all of this. We need Muslims in this country, especially, to take ownership of problems like this, and root out any kind of extremist preaching or teaching in the mosques, community centres, or amongst the groups that try to defend or justify or apologise for such attacks.
I think there was a question shortly after this attack took place on Question Time, where a member of the audience attempted to show a piece of the extremist material from one of these mosques, from a leaflet, and they were shut down quite strictly by other members of the audience. So I guess my next question is that, do you think that the mainstream media is perhaps a little worried on reporting on the facts that you've just revealed because they're worried about fueling prejudice, fueling what they describe as Islamophobia?
Yes, and I mean, and that is a valid issue. I saw that national chat show, and as you said, media and society, people have to be responsible on both sides, and we don't want to tar all Muslims. So you could understand.
But if something like that's happening, more of us should know about it. It shouldn't probably, and I say this respectfully, but it shouldn't take your organisation to expose this. There should be actually, mainstream journalists should be exposing this happening. And as you rightfully point out, other people within your community. And I don't feel like when this happens, and I respect what you're saying, that it does need to be done extremely responsibly, I don't think that we hear about that enough.
Yeah, Chris, and it's something, I agree with you. It's something we need to do more, because on the one hand, we have the Islamist extremists, as we saw, with deadly effect, with so many terrorist attacks. On the other hand, we had far right, neo-Nazi extremists actually have been firebombing mosques and have been threatening to attack mosques, for example. So, for example, that leaflet, there was an extremist leaflet or two, those have been given out. What would have been better for the Muslims from that mosque in the audience if they'd said, that's a terrible leaflet, and we will make sure nothing like that is propagated ever again. Because, there are 2,000 mosques in this country, roughly, and many of them take part in a Meet Your Neighbor Day or, an open mosque day every year. Hundreds of mosques around the country have an open mosque day where everybody in the community is welcome. They come and have a cup of tea. They get to know their community. We need more of that, mosques to be more welcoming. And that kind of good work is sadly undermined, obviously, by terrorism, but also, as you say, by closing down the debate. It's much better to say, just hold a hand up and say, "Oh, sorry, yeah, we did have one or two extremist sermons, we did have one or two extremist leaflets, but we're going to do our utmost to make sure that doesn't happen again. We will root out that kind of thing. No extremist imams will be allowed to give such sermons. No extremist groups will be allowed to hand out leaflets outside or inside our mosque." I did that at my own mosque, and I had arguments and confrontations with extremists and terrorist supporting groups. Actually, many Muslims up and down the country, men and women, have done that and actually have put themselves at risk, have suffered a lot of abuse, intimidation, harassment by standing up and saying, we are not going to accept terrorism or extremism in our name.
And that is also something we really need to hear more about. I think what is frustrating is that I think what then fuels the far right is this perception that nothing is being done about it. And for me, if there is someone like yourself finding extremist material, if there's someone like other Muslims who are challenging people in their mosques who are coming up with this stuff, I think that needs to be shouted from the rooftops. I think that we need to all know that that's happening so that we can see that it's happening both within your community, which will put you in the best, and let's face it, you're in the best place position, people in your community, to hear when these sorts of things are happening. But I think it would reassure the wider community, and it would also give the wider community, I think, more ammunition to challenge the far right morons, because we could say, and everyone could say to them, well, look, why are you acting like that when the community themselves are dealing with this problem?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Cristo. I mean, I think, most Muslims in this country and others would really appreciate that and echo your words. It is an issue for all of the.
But I think a lot of people are scared to talk about that, and I think a lot of Muslims are scared to actually admit when it happens too, because they're worried, probably fairly, about, as we said, prejudice that would drive, because for a bit, inevitably, some people would say, well, look, yeah, there you go, we were right all along, it's happening. And I think until we got that out the way, I think that there would be a worry about that.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. People are intimidated and they're worried about fueling Islamophobia or, anti-Muslim hatred or the far right. As I said, sadly, a number of mosques have been attacked, and there have been terrorist attacks against mosques and Muslims. In fact, I've served as an imam in this country for over 35 years. I began young, but the very first mosque I started at was the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, which was attacked by a far-right terrorist, Darren Osborne. And sadly, a Muslim grandfather, was killed in that attack some years ago. So, we are aware of that kind of situation, but also the extremists tend to intimidate Muslims who speak up. And they accuse us of being sellouts or for just saying that we're proud to be British and Muslim. Because don't forget, the extremists believe that you can only have loyalty to Islam and Muslims only, as though that's somehow incompatible with being British or with British values. And this is a major mistake. Surveys have sadly showed that too high a proportion of not only British people but also British Muslims feel that there is an incompatibility between Islam and British values. The wider British public says that a lot, according to polling, and this goes back to the misconceptions that you were talking about.
And again, that is going to be fueled by some extreme Islamic countries as well. Some. I respect what you say, that not all are extreme Islamic countries, but some.
Yes, absolutely. But and that's why we need more understanding, awareness. As I said, there's almost 50 Muslim majority countries, 1.5 billion or more Muslims in the world. It's a very huge and diverse number, and it's very unfair to taint them all with the actions of a few authoritarian regimes. Just as there's only one Jewish state in the world, it would be very unfair to tar all Jews with
No,
policy or
absolutely,
action
and
of the state.
I totally get that, and it's important to point out that there are some Muslim countries that don't engage in that. It's unfortunately, though, I think the ones that do, that then sort of get a connection to what we have been discussing tonight. Really good to talk to you, and that is, of course, the Iman Dr Usama Hasan from Quilliam International talking to us, and I think it was what a breath of fresh air of common sense to hear that from an imam saying that he's had to challenge extremist material in mosques from moronic people who think that Islamic extremism is the way forward.